In the early 1900s, sponge divers off the coast of a little island called Antikythera near Greece found a wreckage, and they brought up a great many relics. Among them was this thing we've referred to as the Antikythera device. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with all of the documentaries that talk about this. Every time I watch one of these documentaries, I have questions that no one has addressed. They've talked about how did they make it? How did they even know how to make it? My question is this: why did they make it? There are a great many things that science doesn't even address on this, and in today's video, I would like to start with some things that are glaringly apparent that I think virtually everyone has missed. But we have to start here. With your modern knowledge, 21st century knowledge, if I gave you a basic survival pack like what I'm showing on the right, and maybe a good knife, and I was able to send you back in time to, say, 100 BC, or maybe just after, maybe 100 AD, how would you use your 21st century knowledge to give yourself an edge, even if you had all of these modern things on the right? Well, it would be very difficult one way or the other. Even with a blanket, rope, an axe, a knife, a little bowl, some gloves, it would be incredibly difficult. The reason I have the image on the left is there was this show called Lost, where there was a plane crash and they were a group of people put out into this survival situation. You would be in survival mode, but the people of the modern time, in 100 AD or 100 BC, however you want to look at it, would be in normal life mode. Now, here's the crazy thing about that device. I brought up these two images so that people could really get a concept of what I'm talking about. On the right, what we have is a gentleman who's made a very basic lean-to. Now, when you look at what he has, he's got clearly a plastic tarp there, he's got a bag, a pair of modern boots, he's got himself a hoodie, a cup for coffee, a lot of very modern things interjected into what looks like a very low-tech area. Now, look at the guy on the left. He's in a jungle, but look what he's been able to construct. He's got a pool, he's got a shelter that's very well built, it's got a pitched roof, but you don't see any modern tech around. Now, I'm sure some modern tech and knowledge was used in the creation of it, but it makes for a great contrast. See, this is my issue with the Antikythera device. The technology and knowledge needed to create it would have pointed to lower levels of technology. Meaning, why aren't we finding watches or clocks from that era? Because to create these teeny tiny little machined gears and spindles and bearings would have been the end result of a development of technology. It wouldn't, you don't go from zero to Antikythera. Just like you don't go from, let me see if I can bring these images back up, hold on. You don't go from a lean-to this in one leap. There would be different levels, and we see this historically. You know, you could take a smartphone into the past, into your time travel trip back there, and it would be hopelessly impossible for them to reverse engineer it. You could take a regular telephone from the 1950s back, they still couldn't reverse engineer it. You see, creating something like this would have been nearly impossible just to create the plans for it. Because what do you need to create plans? Well, you would need something to write things down on. How do we assimilate knowledge? Let's say you had all of the knowledge in your head and you could remember every little detail of every little gear, and all you needed to do was have a place to write it down to build it from. You need paper, you need pencils. This was the group. There's a video out there, and I'll give you a link to it, called the Antikythera Cosmos. It's on Vimeo. And they have a mathematician, a materials scientist, an imaging specialist, an archaeometallurgist, a horologist, which is a guy who builds clocks and watches, and a physicist. And they brought together all these people, and even they still have questions. Because something this complicated would have had ancestors. It would have had mechanical ancestors. Where are they? See, I don't believe the people of the era built it. It's not possible. They just wouldn't have had the ability to. For example, this is a guy who started to study this back in the early part of the 1900s, Albert Rem. Here's his research notes. Well, what do we see here? What can we derive from this? Well, we have a nice, flat, pretty piece of paper with grid lines on it. Clearly, this was done in pencil. How do we create pencils? They're mass-produced. This is all post-industrial revolution technology just to create this little pencil sketch. Plus, he had a nice flat surface to write on. You see, in 100 BC or 100 AD, however you want to look at it, they had workshops, and I'm sure they had benches and work tables, but they weren't flat enough to write on, not in a way that you could have created detailed plans to create this mechanism. And this, now fast forward to the 1950s when they're still studying it. The technology needed to create the calipers being held in this man's hands rival that of what would be needed to create the mechanism he's measuring. There would have been all sorts of tools that would have been needed to be created just to create the machine. And where is that? And now we fast forward even farther to where they have broken this down on a nice, pretty piece of paper of what all these gears did, all the gear counts, all of the different things. It was designed to measure the movement of the planets. And like I said, even if you had all of the knowledge, even if you had a book that you could take back to 100 BC with you, with all of this information, it would be hopelessly impossible to find the metals, machine the metals, create all of the different things that would be necessary just to produce it. And there's also something they say in the video that really puts all this in perspective. I brought this picture up to just show you all of the tools, modern tools they were using just to try to figure the thing out. Got a little machine hammer here, you've got Sharpie markers, you've got measuring tools and devices, all of these far more complicated than to create, than the device itself. See, there were inscriptions, and this is what I've never heard anybody talk about. There were inscriptions on the device that acted, and this is their words, not mine, you can listen to it for yourself, as a user guide. Wait a minute. What, a user guide? Why would you need to create a user guide? If you were the one creating it and you were the one who had all the knowledge of how the planets moved, ergo being able to create the device, were you making it for someone else who would need to know how to use it? And if so, was this a commercial device, meaning you sold it to somebody for money, meaning there were more of them? This was some of the words that they were able to get off this device. The little spheres travels, little pointer projecting from Stilben is Mercury, Phosphorus is Venus, Aries Pyrrhus is Mars, Phaeton is, of course, Saturn, and Phaenon is Jupiter. So the fact that they had all this knowledge by itself is stunning. But and even the ability to machine the metals. Who? How many people? Where are all the precursor devices? That would have been so easy, much easier to make. Synodic cycles were known. And the real kicker here is, okay, so you have this device, right, that knows how to track the planets. For what purpose? To sail your ship around the Aegean, around the Mediterranean in a more efficient way? Because that's where they're tracing this to, ancient Greece. You know, they said it was probably derived from something from ancient Babylon, where they wrote down literally daily locations of planets and all this kind of stuff. Even so, what was the purpose? Here's another thing they never address. How did they do the measurements? There was no such thing as the metric system or any other system at the time. They wouldn't have known what a millimeter was or what a centimeter was or even an inch or any other thing. And all of that would have been necessary to create this stuff. You would have had to have a system of measurement. You see, these are the things that nobody asks. 1 second. Sorry about that. Trying to move this image over. There we go. Of a clock. There would have been clocks. Clocks are far simpler, far easier to create than the Antikythera mechanism. Why don't we find those? And here's the final thing I'll leave with that is also never brought up. It's the social aspect of this. If you had a society that was so advanced that you were not in survival mode, meaning if you had the ability to stare up at the stars and think about their movement and think about the movement of the planets and then formulate some plan to create something like the Antikythera device, it shows what you were not worrying about. What you were not worrying about clothing, you were not worrying about food, you were not worrying about shelter, you were not worrying about safety, probably medical care of any kind. That was probably all taken care of. Because science and philosophy and religion and art, they're all luxury items that are signs of an advanced society and an advanced civilization. And we don't have any evidence that shows those societies were at that level. That's the problem with the Antikythera device, is that peoples of that time, their days would have been filled with survival mode stuff. Not just being able to be dedicated to something so superfluous. A device so complicated and so complex for the only purpose of sailing a ship in a more accurate way for a merchant? Because that would have been, they found it aboard a merchant ship, and how it got there, who knows? But it was clearly a sextant. They know that to be a fact. How could someone have had that much extra time on their hands in that era? Those are the questions nobody asks. And I think it bears asking. Because I honest to God, don't think this is from where they think it's from. I mean, they clearly found it where they found it, but how it got there, I think that's a whole nother thing. That we may have lost evidence of a society far more advanced, and it wasn't the Greeks, it wasn't the Babylonians, than what we may know. And that might point to a lost continent, perhaps, that we have talked about at length. So, I will leave this video there, but those are the questions. The big ones, and I guess I'll probably reiterate them just for clarity. Why did they have so much extra time? How did they create the plans? And where are all of the ancestral less complicated technologies that would have led up to this. You didn't go from swords right to M16s. You didn't go from muskets to Vulcan guns overnight. There would have been preceding technologies and evidence of this type of machine work and machining industry somewhere that would have led to this. Why don't we find that? Because personally, I believe it's there and the history is there. It's just hidden someplace we haven't looked yet. And that place might be on the Southern Pole. So, anyway, God bless. Have a happy week. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.